And we continue with a special coverage of today's paramount consultative referendum in defense of the Essequibo territory. We're now going to tune in with a special set also in Caracas with Jorge Gestoso, who is joined by a special guest to continue analyzing this important day.
Thanks very much, Luis. We have the honor to have with us another guest, Calvin Tucker. Thank you very much for joining us. Calvin, just for the audience, you're the campaign manager for the Morning Star, which means that it's the only socialist daily newspaper in the United Kingdom.
That's correct, thank you.
Calvin, you have been participating also in the event of the 200 years of the Monroe Doctrine. For an audience that is not necessarily familiar what is the Monroe Doctrine, is President of the US, James Monroe, in 1823, had a phrase that he said, "America for the Americans." In your opinion, the Monroe Doctrine is alive and kicking or is dead?
I think if we look at the history of the United States in the 20th century right up to the present day, it's absolutely crystal clear that the Monroe Doctrine is both alive and kicking and extremely flexible in its application.
Interesting that in your case, meaning in the case of the United Kingdom, it has a facet, an angle in this events of the Essequibo, because we're talking that the United Kingdom was taking over Guyana, and therefore it was controversy about what is the division of the land, of the borders with Venezuela. So the United Kingdom was, and eventually indirectly still is, in the center of this event. Tell us.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the conflict over the territory of Essequibo, it goes back, in fact, centuries. But Britain's role was to slowly push the borders of the British territory of Guyana slowly westward. And that culminated in the biased treaty in 1899, which granted Britain control over that territory. And what viewers in Britain or North America might not understand is that Venezuelan representatives were not participating in that tribunal. And yet the International Court of Justice has just the other day had a judgment that treaty stands and supersedes the 1966 Geneva Accords, which were to provide the framework for an amicable agreement between Venezuela, Guyana, and Britain.
So basically, historically, we were talking that, for example, the Monroe Doctrine, supposedly saying that America for the Americans was to defend the continent against the former colonizers, including the United Kingdom. So basically, at the end of the day, also the US is not defending America, is joining forces with the United Kingdom against Venezuela.
Absolutely, and of course, the United States is the offspring of my country. And I think that explains an awful lot of American history.
So, and how do you put in perspective today's event, today's plebiscite, referendum, how you see it? What's your assessment?
Well, I mean, my assessment of it is that this conflict is principally about whose side prevails. Does Guyana, backed by the United States, backed by ExxonMobil, who have 10 years ago had a huge discovery of oil and natural gas and other minerals in Essequibo, does their side prevail, and does the ruling of the tribunal in 1899 prevail, or do the Geneva Accords prevail from 1966? Now that might appear to be simply a technical issue, but on what planet does an agreement of 125 years ago, where one party to the conflict was not present, prevail and supersede the later agreement in modern times in 1966, which set out a framework for the resolution of the discussion, which took into the dispute rather, which took into account the interests and sovereignty of all the parties involved. It seems very clear to me that 1966 supersedes 1899.
And in terms of managing the message, we're talking about rhetoric. Guyana is trying to paint themselves that they are the victims. That is Venezuela, the country that is aggressing them, that they're trying to take part of their interests, when in reality the fact is that Guyana, without having dissolved and respond about a part of, especially the waters around, they're using it, and also including parts of the waters that belongs to Venezuela. So basically, if there's someone or a country that is basically aggressed or victim, is Venezuela. It's not exactly what Guyana says, which is quite the contrary.
Well, of course. I mean, for the past over 50 years since 1966, there's been little, if any, progress on resolving this dispute. Now, it may well be that there are some aspects to Guyana's case which are legitimate and credible, but that can only be settled within the framework of talks between the two countries. But what Guyana has done, and actually I say Guyana, but really we're talking about the United States behind them and the big oil companies behind Guyana. I think it's really a dispute with the United States and with ExxonMobil more than it's a dispute with Guyana. But what's actually happened in the current context is that you have this huge oil find. Of course Guyana wants to keep all this for itself. You've only got 125,000 people living in this territory in pretty grim conditions without much human rights, with a fairly low level of social and economic development. So quite clearly the interests of the people who live there have not been taken into account in modern times either. And I think that's a factor that's often overlooked in this dispute.
You've been visiting Venezuela many times. This is not your first time. What do you have witnessed since you came here for the first time?
Well, I first came here in 2001, just after 9/11, the attack on the World Trade Center in New York. And I have to say, this was only 10 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I didn't take this process seriously at the time. I'd heard of this guy, Hugo Chavez, with a red hat, and I just assumed he was another Latin American populist, and this would quickly drift into the normal form of authoritarian rule, with ordinary people being left behind and left out of that process. And when I first came here at the time, I was absolutely struck by the sense of excitement in the streets. People really felt that the old system had failed them in a most spectacular way, both economically in terms of their basic services, but also with their human rights. People here in Caracas were massacred in 1988 in the in what was called the Caracazo, where the government sent the army into the barrios to shoot ordinary people, women and children, people who were stealing spaghetti to eat. And Hugo Chavez, interestingly, somebody who came from a military background, an unusual background for somebody on the left, had rebelled against this system in 1992 and had been jailed and then later released and had stood for president.
Right, won the election in 1998 and took over in 1999.
Yeah.
And then?
And then curiously, when Chavez first came into office, he didn't describe himself as a socialist at all. In fact, he looked towards my country, towards Tony Blair at the time, looked for some kind of third way between capitalism and socialism. And it was really the attitude of the domestic elites here, big business here, and the institutions here, together with opposition from the United States, which prevented Chavez from implementing even a very modest program of social and economic reform. So I see Chavez's electoral victory very much as the electoral ratification of the military-civilian rebellion of 1992, and his economic and political program as something that was really developed on the job, as we would say in English, and he learnt his trade as a president and what worked and what didn't work in office, rather than having come to office with a preset ideology. So from that perspective, it's probably one of the most interesting political processes in world history.
The UK is not necessarily the best friend from this revolution, if you want. So much so that, for example, there is gold deposited in the central bank in the UK. The president of Venezuela wants that gold that belongs to Venezuela back, and the UK refuses. The UK recognized as a president someone who stand on the street one day and say, I'm the new president. So there's still that mentality of colonialism from the UK to Venezuela and to Latin America?
Absolutely. I mean, I wish I could apologise on behalf of King Charles for the nefarious role that Britain has played in the internal affairs of Venezuela over many years. Of course, we are considered in global terms the poodle of the United States. Policy is set in Washington and in Downing Street, the home of the British Prime Minister. The general consensus politically in Britain is that we must carry out US policy. So that's the central reason why Britain has taken a hostile attitude to Venezuela, specifically with regards to the gold that's being held in the vaults of the Bank of England. It's over $1 billion of Venezuela's gold. It's your natural resource. You stored it with us in good faith, and when you came back to ask for your property to be returned, we said no, it belongs to a self-declared president, Juan Guaido, who never even stood for the position as president in the first place. But what's most concerning about this is even the opposition in Venezuela has removed Juan Guaido as their leader.
It's gone.
So there is no dispute globally. There is no dispute here that there is only one president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, and there is only one government in Venezuela. So if this gold doesn't belong to Venezuela, to the government of Venezuela, it certainly can't belong to Juan Guaido. So we have no legal basis or moral or political basis
not to give it back to the official government of President Maduro.
And I'd just like to add something else. This is not simply a matter of legal technicalities. From the perspective of Britain, what kind of signal are we sending out to the world that you store your property, you do business with Britain, and we may or may not give back what is rightfully yours? I'd say that sends an extremely poor message of reliability of Britain as a government and the reliability of British business. I'd say it's bad for investment in Britain. But more importantly, when I walk around the streets of Caracas or other parts of Venezuela, people here are suffering under sanctions. Your public services have decayed from the high point of Chavismo. The transportation system has problems, the health system has problems. Your country needs this gold returned so it can be spent on providing a decent standard of living and a future for people that live here. And that's the most important thing in this dispute.
Calvin Tucker, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
We have been talking with Calvin Tucker. Officially, his title is Campaign Manager for the Morning Star, the only socialist daily newspaper in the United Kingdom.